Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. In the frontier town of Coldwater Ridge, a mountain man named Jacob Stone faced an impossible choice: obey the corrupt mayor's order to let a dying woman perish in the storm, or risk everything he had to save a stranger's life. He chose mercy. What Jacob didn't know was that the woman lying in that muddy street was Catherine Whitmore, heir to a railroad fortune worth millions. And the mayor had every reason to want her dead. Now Jacob finds himself caught between a powerful man who'll stop at nothing to protect his secrets and a woman whose very existence threatens to expose years of corruption. But what happens when the truth finally comes to light? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory in 1887 was a place where a man could still disappear if he wanted to. Jacob Stone had done exactly that 15 years prior, trading his cavalry scout uniform for buckskins and solitude. He'd built himself a life in the mountains above Coldwater Ridge, a modest cabin tucked into a pine-covered slope where the only voices he heard were the wind and the occasional elk bugling in autumn. He came down to town once a month for supplies, no more than necessary. The visits followed a pattern worn smooth by repetition: trade his furs and venison at the general store, pick up coffee and ammunition, maybe stop by the blacksmith if his traps needed mending. He spoke little, paid in cash or barter, and was back on the trail before sunset. The townspeople knew him as a quiet man, honest in his dealings, who preferred the company of mountains to people. Coldwater Ridge itself sat in a valley where 3 streams converged, the kind of location that promised prosperity when the first settlers arrived. That promise had been fulfilled, though not in the way those early pioneers might have hoped. The town had grown, but its growth had been shaped by one man's hand more than any natural evolution. Mayor Edmund Blackwood owned the largest general store, held shares in the assay office, and controlled the land office that processed mining claims. He was a man in his mid-50s, well-dressed in eastern suits that seemed out of place against the rough timber buildings, with steel-grey hair and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. He'd been mayor for 12 years, and in that time, Coldwater Ridge had become less a community and more a company town where Blackwood was the company. The hierarchy was clear to anyone who paid attention. At the top stood Blackwood and his inner circle, the sheriff he'd appointed, the judge who owed him money, the banker who processed his transactions without questions. Below them came the enforcers, men like Wade Drummond who kept order the way Blackwood defined it. Drummond was tall and lean, with a gunfighter's eyes, and a reputation for solving the mayor's problems with quiet efficiency. Then came the struggling merchants who paid Blackwood's rents, the miners who sold their claims to his assay office at prices he set, and the families who worked in his businesses for wages that kept them dependent. At the bottom were those who dared to cross him and learned the cost. Their names were whispered as warnings: the rancher who'd lost his water rights, the shopkeeper whose store burned down, the miner who'd fallen down a shaft after complaining about claim jumping. Doc Harrison was one of the few who still stood somewhat apart from Blackwood's influence. He was 72, with hands that trembled slightly from age, but steadied the moment they touched a patient. He'd been practicing medicine in Coldwater Ridge for 30 years, long before Blackwood arrived, and his clinic near the edge of town was one place where people still came regardless of their ability to pay. The doc survived because Blackwood needed him, a town without a physician being bad for business. But there was history between them, old wounds that neither man spoke about openly. Jacob had noticed the way Doc's eyes would go distant sometimes, the way he'd pause when passing the cemetery on the hill. He'd heard whispers about the Doc's son, a young man who'd challenged Blackwood over a forged land deed and been found dead a week later. The official verdict was accident, but the Doc had aged a decade in that single year. Into this carefully balanced world of power and submission Catherine Whitmore had arrived the previous Tuesday on the afternoon stage. She'd stepped down from the coach, wearing a travelling dress that marked her as someone from back east, carrying a leather document case that she kept close to her side. She'd taken a room at the boarding house and spent the next 3 days asking questions. She'd been to the land office, requesting to see surveys and deeds. She'd visited the railway station, speaking with the station master about shipping schedules and freight contracts. She'd even appeared at the mayor's office, though what was discussed there, no one knew. But the tension in town had risen like mercury in a thermometer since her arrival. Jacob had seen her twice during his monthly visits, once in the general store, where she'd been examining a map of the territory with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest, and again outside the land office, where she'd emerged with her jaw set and her eyes bright with barely controlled anger. He'd thought little of it at the time. Rich folks from the east came through occasionally, looking to invest in mining claims or railway developments. Most found the reality of frontier life less romantic than they'd imagined and returned home within a month. But there was something different about Catherine Whitmore. She didn't have the wide-eyed wonder of a tourist or the calculating coldness of a speculator. She had the focused determination of someone on a mission, and in a town like Coldwater Ridge, missions tended to be dangerous. The unease had been building all week. Jacob felt it in the way conversations stopped when he entered the general store, in the nervous glances the shopkeeper threw toward the mayor's office across the street. Even the usual frontier gossip had taken on a darker tone. People spoke in lower voices about railway contracts and Eastern money, about documents that didn't match up and questions that shouldn't be asked. Sarah Chen, who ran the Chinese laundry near the edge of town, had pulled Jacob aside 2 days ago during his last visit. She was a small woman with iron in her spine, a widow who'd survived loss and prejudice to build a modest business. Her husband had died 3 years back in what the sheriff called a robbery gone wrong. Sarah knew it was punishment for refusing to sell their property to Blackwood at his offered price. "Be careful, Mr. Stone," she'd said quietly, her accent thick but her English clear. "Storm is coming, not just in the sky." Jacob had looked at the mountains then, seeing the dark clouds building over the peaks. Late autumn storms in Montana could be brutal, dropping snow in the high country and turning the streets of Coldwater Ridge into rivers of mud. He'd planned to finish his business and head back to his cabin before the weather broke. But as he'd walked through town that afternoon, checking his mental list of supplies, he'd seen Mayor Blackwood and Wade Drummond standing outside the land office, speaking in low tones. Drummond had nodded once, then headed toward the boarding house with purposeful strides. Blackwood's face had been set in lines of cold determination. Jacob had learned in the cavalry to recognize when violence was brewing. The signs were always the same. A certain tension in the air, men checking their weapons, hard eyes measuring distances. He'd felt those signs building all afternoon, the way pressure builds before a storm breaks. He'd finished his business at the blacksmith just as the first drops began to fall. Thunder rolled down from the mountains, and the shopkeepers started pulling their goods inside. The street emptied quickly as people sought shelter. Jacob had headed for the general store, planning to wait out the worst of it before making the trek back to his cabin. That's when he'd heard the shouting from the mayor's office. The rain was coming down harder now, but even through the downpour, Jacob could hear a woman's voice raised in anger and accusation. Mayor Blackwood's response was lower, harder to make out, but the menace in his tone carried through the walls. Jacob stood under the awning of the general store, his hand resting on the worn handle of his hunting knife out of old habit. The shopkeeper, a nervous man named Preston, came to stand beside him. "Best not to get involved, Mr. Stone," Preston said quietly. "Whatever's happening in there, it's between the mayor and that Eastern lady. Not our concern." But as Jacob watched, the door to the mayor's office burst open. Catherine Whitmore stumbled out, clutching her document case to her chest. Wade Drummond and another of Blackwood's men followed, their hands on her arms, forcing her forward despite her resistance. "You're making a mistake," Catherine was saying, her voice strong despite the rain now soaking through her dress. "I have proof. Federal authorities will investigate." Mayor Blackwood appeared in the doorway, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His voice carried across the street with absolute certainty. "Miss Whitmore, you're going to have an unfortunate accident in this storm. Very sad. These mountain roads can be so dangerous." The men shoved her forward. Catherine stumbled, her foot catching in the mud, and she went down hard in the middle of the flooded street. The document case flew from her hands, landing several feet away in a puddle. Jacob saw Wade Drummond pick up the case and hand it to the mayor, saw Blackwood tuck it under his arm with a satisfied nod, saw Catherine struggling to rise from the mud, the rain pouring down on her, and the two men stepping back, leaving her there. Then Mayor Blackwood's eyes found Jacob across the street. The distance between them was perhaps 30 yards, but the message in that gaze was clear as words. "This is none of your business, Stone. Walk away." Jacob felt Preston's hand on his arm. "Don't," the shopkeeper whispered. "He'll destroy you. He destroys everyone who crosses him." In the street, Catherine had managed to get to her hands and knees. She was coughing, gasping, trying to stand but slipping in the mud. The rain was cold, the kind of cold that could kill someone in their weakened state. Jacob could see she was already struggling, her movements becoming slower, less coordinated. Mayor Blackwood walked to the edge of his covered porch, watching her with the detached interest of a man observing an insect drown in a puddle. Then he raised his voice so it would carry to Jacob and anyone else watching from their windows. "Let her die or lose everything, Stone. Your credit at the stores, your trading privileges, your place here. All of it ends if you interfere. This is your only warning." The storm intensified, thunder cracking overhead. Catherine collapsed forward again, face down in the mud. Jacob Stone stood at a crossroads more significant than any he'd faced in 15 years of solitude. Jacob's father had taught him that a man's character was defined not by what he did when people were watching, but by what he did when walking away would be easier. Standing under that awning, rain hammering down around him, Jacob felt the weight of that lesson pressing on his chest like a physical thing. He'd come to these mountains to escape the weight of his choices during the wars. He'd seen what happened when good men did nothing, when they followed orders that violated their conscience, when they chose survival over principle. He'd watched villages burn, watched families torn apart, watched the strong prey on the weak, while other strong men stood by and let it happen. That's what had broken him in the end. Not the violence itself, but his own participation in it. His own silence, when silence became complicity. Preston's grip tightened on his arm. "Jacob, please, think about what you're doing." But Jacob was already moving, stepping out from under the awning into the downpour. The cold rain hit him like a slap, but he barely felt it. His boots splashed through the flooding street, each step deliberate, final. Catherine Whitmore had stopped moving. She lay face down in the mud, her breathing shallow and labored. The rain had plastered her dark hair to her skull, and her dress was so soaked with water and mud that it looked like the earth itself was trying to swallow her. Jacob reached her and knelt, his hands gentle as he turned her over. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with shock and cold. She tried to speak, but only a weak cough came out. "I've got you," Jacob said quietly. "You're going to be all right." Mayor Blackwood's voice cut through the rain. "Stone, I warned you." Jacob didn't answer. He slid one arm under Catherine's shoulders and the other beneath her knees, lifting her from the mud with practiced ease. She weighed almost nothing, or perhaps his old cavalry training had simply returned, muscle memory from years of carrying wounded men from battlefields. He turned to face the mayor. Blackwood stood on his porch with Wade Drummond beside him, both men watching with expressions that promised consequences. "You've made your choice," Blackwood said, his voice cold as the rain. "You'll regret it, Stone. Before this is over, you'll wish you'd let her die." Jacob met his eyes across the distance. Maybe, but I'll still be able to look at myself in a mirror. He walked past them, Catherine's unconscious form cradled against his chest, heading for Doc Harrison's clinic at the far end of town. Each step took him further from the life he'd built, further from the peace he'd found. He could feel eyes watching from windows, could sense the town holding its breath. The clinic door was closed against the storm. Jacob kicked it with his boot, 3 solid thuds. "Doc, it's Stone. I need help." A long moment passed. Jacob could imagine the old doctor on the other side of that door, weighing his options, calculating the cost of opening it. Then he heard the bolt slide back, and Doc Harrison's weathered face appeared in the gap. The old man took one look at Catherine, then at Jacob's determined expression, and something shifted in his eyes. "Get her inside." Quickly. The clinic was warm and dry, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Doc had a cot ready in the examination room, and Jacob laid Catherine down gently. She was shivering now, a good sign that her body was still fighting, but her lips had taken on a bluish tint. "Pneumonia risk is high," Doc said, already moving with the efficiency of decades of practice. "We need to get her warm and dry. Stone, there's blankets in that cabinet. Bring them all." For the next hour, Jacob worked alongside Doc Harrison in focused silence. They stripped away Catherine's wet clothing, wrapped her in warm blankets, built up the fire in the small stove until the room was almost stifling. Doc listened to her lungs with his stethoscope, his expression growing more concerned with each breath she took. "Fluid in the lungs already," he said quietly. "The cold, the stress, being face down in that water. We're going to have a fight on our hands." Jacob stood back, watching the old doctor work. His hands had stopped trembling, steadied by purpose the way Jacob's had steadied when he'd made his choice in the street. There was something almost sacred in the moment. 2 men who'd been running from their pasts, suddenly choosing to stand and face whatever came. "Why'd you let me in?" Jacob asked after a while. Doc didn't look up from preparing a tincture. "Been asking myself that for the last hour." "And?" The old man paused, staring down at his wrinkled hands. "My son died because I was too afraid to stand up when it mattered. He stood up alone, and Blackwood killed him for it. I told myself it was wisdom, waiting for the right time, being practical." He looked at Jacob then, and his eyes were wet. "But it was just cowardice dressed up in reasonable words. Doc, you standing in that rain, walking toward that girl when everyone else was walking away. That was my boy, Jacob. That was what he would have done, and I'll be damned if I turn my back again." Thunder rolled overhead, and rain lashed against the windows. Catherine stirred on the cot, her breathing ragged but present. Doc returned to her side, checking her pulse, adjusting the blankets. "She's strong," he said, "but this next night is critical. If the fever takes hold, if the pneumonia settles in her lungs." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Jacob settled into a wooden chair near the door. "I'll stay. Blackwood will come for you. Maybe not tonight in this storm, but he'll come. I know. You could still leave. Take your horse and head up into the high country before dawn. He can't touch you up there." Jacob thought about his cabin, the solitude he'd cherished, the peace he'd found in those mountains. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been only hours. "That's not living, Doc. That's just a slower kind of dying." The old man smiled faintly. "Took me 40 years to learn that. You figured it out faster than me." They sat together through the long hours of the night, taking turns checking on Catherine, keeping the fire burning, listening to the storm rage outside. Around midnight, Doc made coffee, and they drank it in silence, 2 old soldiers on watch. Dawn came grey and reluctant, the storm having passed, but leaving the sky heavy with clouds. Catherine's fever had risen during the night despite their efforts. She mumbled in her delirium, fragments of words that made little sense. "Railway," she whispered at one point. "Father's money. Proof. Must tell them." Doc wiped her forehead with a cool cloth. "She came here for a reason. Whatever it was, it scared Blackwood enough to want her dead. Jacob had been thinking about that through the long night. The document case. Blackwood took it. Whatever proof she had, he has it now. Then we need to find out what it was. We? Doc looked at him steadily. I'm in this now, Stone. Might as well be all the way in. The morning brought consequences, just as promised. Jacob went to the general store to buy supplies and found Preston standing in the doorway, arms crossed. Can't sell to you, Jacob. Mayor's orders. No credit, no cash sales, nothing. Preston, I'm sorry. I got a family to feed, you understand. Jacob understood. He tried the blacksmith next, found the same answer. By noon, it was clear that every business in Coldwater Ridge had received the same instructions. Jacob Stone was cut off, isolated, marked as an outcast. He returned to the clinic to find Doc cooking a thin soup over the stove. How'd it go? About as expected. Jacob sank into the chair, suddenly feeling the weight of his sleepless night. Can't buy food, can't get supplies. I'm persona non grata. Welcome to the club. I've been managing on what my patients pay me in trade. Eggs, vegetables, the occasional chicken. Doc ladled soup into 2 bowls. It's not much, but it'll keep us alive. Catherine coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made both men wince. Doc went to her side immediately, helping her sit up slightly, supporting her while she struggled to breathe. Her eyes opened, clearer than they'd been all night. She looked at Doc, then at Jacob, confusion crossing her face. Where? She managed to whisper. Doc Harrison's clinic, Jacob said, moving to her other side. You're safe. The case. My documents. The mayor has them. Panic flared in her eyes. She tried to sit up, but Doc held her down gently. Easy now. You've got pneumonia. You're not going anywhere. You don't understand. Those papers, evidence, my father, $3 million. Each word cost her, and she collapsed back against the pillow, exhausted by the effort. Jacob and Doc exchanged glances. $3 million. No wonder Blackwood had wanted her dead. Who's your father? Doc asked gently. Thomas Whitmore, railway magnate. He invested in Montana expansion. Blackwood, fraud, took everything. The pieces began falling into place. Doc sat back slowly, his face pale. Thomas Whitmore. I read about his death in the papers 6 months back. One of the wealthiest men in Boston. Catherine's eyes found Jacob's. You saved me. Why? Jacob thought about all the complicated reasons. All the history and guilt and broken pieces of his past that had led him to that moment in the rain. But in the end, the answer was simple. Because it was the right thing to do. A tear slid down her cheek. It may have cost you everything. I've lost everything before. I survived it. I'll survive this. But even as he said it, Jacob heard the sound of boots on the clinic's front steps. Heavy, purposeful boots. Multiple sets of them. Doc stood, his hand moving instinctively toward the shotgun he kept near the door. The knock came hard and authoritative. Then Wade Drummond's voice, cold and clear through the wooden door. Stone, we need to talk. The mayor wants to see you. Now. Jacob looked at Catherine, fighting for her life on that cot. Looked at Doc, standing ready to defend her despite his 72 years. Thought about the choice he'd made in the rain and all the choices that would follow from it. He stood, checking that his knife was secure at his belt. I'll go talk to them. Jacob, Doc said. Don't. If I don't, they'll come in. Better to face this on the street than in here with her. He walked to the door, took a deep breath, and opened it to face whatever came next. The morning light was grey and unforgiving, and Wade Drummond stood on the steps with 3 other men, all armed, all watching Jacob with the flat eyes of men who'd been given orders they intended to follow. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be, Drummond said. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him. What does the mayor want? He wants you to understand that there are consequences for the choices you make. Drummond's hand rested casually on his gun. and he wants you to know that this is your last chance to make the right choice. I already made my choice. Then God help you, Stone, because nobody else in this town will. The morning of the telegram attempt dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that made the Montana sky look impossibly blue. Jacob woke before sunrise, his body responding to years of habit in the mountains where dawn meant the beginning of hunting hours. He lay still for a moment, listening to Doc snoring from the next room and the quiet sounds of Catherine moving about in the clinic. He found her in the examination room, fully dressed for the first time in days. She'd borrowed one of Sarah Chen's simpler dresses, something that wouldn't mark her as an Eastern lady. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and though she was still pale, there was steel in her posture. "You should be resting," Jacob said. "I've rested enough. Today I start taking back my father's legacy." She held up a silver pocket watch, turning it over in her hands so the lamplight caught the engraving on the back. "He gave me this the day before he died. Read what it says." Jacob took the watch carefully. The inscription was worn but legible. "Truth will outlast lies. For my daughter, who has the courage I lacked." What did he mean? Catherine's expression grew distant. "My father spent his last months investigating the Montana investment. He'd discovered something was wrong, that Blackwood had swindled him. But he was dying, too weak to travel, too proud to admit he'd been fooled. He gave me this watch and told me to find the truth he'd been too afraid to face." She took the watch back, clutching it like a talisman. "He built railroads his whole life, Jacob. Connected cities, created opportunities. He believed in building the future. And then a bitter man exploited that belief and destroyed him. I won't let my father's last act be one of failure." Doc emerged from his room, already dressed, his medical bag in hand. "You ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be." They went over the plan one final time. Jacob would head to the saloon around 11:30, position himself near the horses tied up outside. At exactly noon, when the telegraph office would be busiest, he'd create his distraction. Doc would use the chaos to slip into the telegraph office, present the telegram, and convince Ernest Miller to send it despite the risk. Catherine would remain at the clinic, watching from the window. If anything went wrong, if Blackwood's men figured out what they were doing, she was to barricade herself in the examination room and wait for help. None of them mentioned what would happen if help didn't come. At 11 o'clock, Jacob started his casual walk toward the center of town. He kept his movements relaxed, stopping to examine the blacksmith's window display, nodding to the few townspeople who'd acknowledge him. The tension in his gut reminded him of pre-battle nerves from his cavalry days, that heightened awareness where every sound and movement mattered. He noticed Wade Drummond leaning against a post near the mayor's office, watching the street with the patient attention of a professional. Two other men Jacob recognized as Blackwood's enforcers were stationed at different points, creating a loose net of observation over the town's center. At 11:30, Jacob reached the saloon. Half a dozen horses were tied to the rail outside, ranging from a calm old mare to a skittish young gelding that danced sideways every time someone walked past. Jacob studied them, planning his move. The key was to make it look completely accidental, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone. He positioned himself near the nervous gelding, seemingly examining a loose board on the saloon's porch. His heart was pounding now, but his hands were steady. Years of cavalry training had taught him how to manage fear, how to function when everything depended on precision. The church bell began to toll noon. On the third chime, Jacob let his foot slip on the porch step, stumbling forward with an exaggerated curse that startled the gelding. The horse whinnied and reared, yanking hard against its tether. The rope snapped, and suddenly there was a panicked horse loose in the street. The old mare, frightened by the gelding's terror, pulled back hard enough to break her own rope. Within seconds, chaos erupted. Horses scattered, people shouted, and a wagon loaded with mining equipment swerved to avoid the animals, its wheel catching in a deep rut and tilting dangerously. Jacob made a show of trying to catch the gelding, running after it in a way that ensured he stayed visible but ineffective. From the corner of his eye, he saw Wade Drummond and the other enforcers moving toward the commotion, saw shopkeepers emerging to help, saw the crowd that had been walking through town center suddenly focused on the runaway horses and teetering wagon. And in that moment of distraction, he saw Doc Harrison slip quietly from the alley beside his clinic and walk with unhurried purpose toward the telegraph office. The chaos lasted a good 10 minutes. By the time Jacob and several miners had managed to corral the horses and right the wagon, the street was a mess of scattered equipment and agitated animals. The saloon owner was shouting about his broken tether rope. The wagon's owner was checking his cargo for damage. Jacob made appropriate apologies, endured some good-natured cursing about clumsy mountain men, and slowly worked his way toward the edge of the crowd. His eyes found the telegraph office. The door was closed, curtains drawn, no sign of Doc or any trouble. Wade Drummond appeared at Jacob's elbow, his expression skeptical. "That was quite a show, Stone." "Accident. You saw it." "I saw something." Drummond's eyes were sharp, assessing. "Question is what I saw." Jacob met his gaze steadily. "Sometimes a spooked horse is just a spooked horse." For a long moment, they stood in silent evaluation of each other. Then Drummond nodded slowly. "Get on out of here, Stone, before the mayor decides to charge you for the damages." Jacob didn't need to be told twice. He headed back toward the clinic with measured steps, not too fast, not looking back. Every instinct screamed at him to check on Doc, to see if the telegram had been sent, but he forced himself to maintain his casual pace. He found Catherine pressed against the window, her face pale with anxiety. "Don't know yet. Doc got into the telegraph office during the chaos. Haven't seen him come out." They waited. 5 minutes stretched to 10, then 15. Jacob's nerves were taut as bowstrings. If something had gone wrong, if Miller had refused, or if Blackwood's men had caught Doc in the act, there would be consequences beyond anything they'd faced so far. The back door opened quietly, and Doc slipped inside, slightly out of breath but smiling. Relief flooded through Jacob like physical warmth. Miller sent it? He did. And Jacob, when I walked in there, Ernest was shaking. His hands could barely hold the telegram form. I thought he'd refuse, but then he looked at me and said, "My daughter's alive because of you, Doc. I won't forget that." Doc sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. He sent it with his own transmission code, marked it urgent. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, "The mayor's going to know. I did this. It'll cost me everything." But he did it anyway. Catherine wiped away tears. "Another person sacrificing for my cause." "Not your cause," Doc corrected gently. "Ours. This is about all of us now, about whether Coldwater Ridge is going to be ruled by one man's corruption or whether we're going to be a real community." Jacob moved to the window, looking out at the town that had been his reluctant home for 15 years. "How long before we hear back from Boston?" "Days, maybe a week. Depends on how quickly Caldwell can act on the information." Catherine joined him at the window. "But we've done it. We've gotten word out. Even if Blackwood moves against us now, someone in Boston knows what happened here." Doc opened his medical bag, pulling out something wrapped in cloth. "Ernest gave me this. Said we might need it." He unwrapped a revolver, old but well-maintained, his father's gun from the war. He said if we're making a stand, we should be armed. Jacob took the weapon, checking the cylinder out of habit. 6 rounds, properly loaded. He met Doc's eyes and saw a question there. Was Jacob really ready to go this far? To potentially use lethal force against Blackwood's men? He thought about Catherine's father's watch and its inscription about truth outlasting lies, thought about Ernest Miller sending that telegram even though it would cost him everything, Thought about all the people in Coldwater Ridge who'd been waiting for someone to stand up first. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Jacob said. "But if it does, we'll be ready." Catherine's hand found her father's pocket watch, clutching it tight. "My father believed in building things, not destroying them. But sometimes you have to tear down the rot before you can build something good in its place." They stood together in Doc's clinic, three unlikely rebels united against a corrupt system, knowing that the next few days would determine not just their own fates, but the future of an entire town. The telegram had been sent. The die was cast. Now all they could do was wait and prepare for whatever came next. Outside, the Montana afternoon stretched toward evening, beautiful and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath its vast sky. And somewhere in his office, Edmund Blackwood was beginning to suspect that the situation had slipped beyond his control. The telegram's departure marked a shift in the atmosphere of Coldwater Ridge. By evening of the same day, Jacob noticed the change. Blackwood's men were more visible on the streets, their patrols more frequent, their attention more focused on Doc's clinic. The mayor knew something had happened, even if he didn't yet know what. Catherine felt it too. She'd recovered enough to move around the clinic without assistance, though Doc still insisted she take things slowly. She spent her days helping him with his other patients, learning the rhythms of frontier medicine, finding purpose in the work. But her eyes constantly drifted to the window, watching for threats or salvation, whichever arrived first. On the second day after the telegram, a wagon arrived from Helena carrying mail and news. The driver, a grizzled man named Cooper, who'd been running the route for 20 years, brought word that made everyone in the clinic go still. "Found a body on the tracks about 15 miles north," Cooper said, accepting the coffee Doc offered him. "Railway conductor named Thomas Hart. Sheriff saying it was an accident, that he slipped and fell. But I knew Tom. He was careful. Worked that line for 10 years without incident." Catherine's face went pale. "Thomas Hart. He was the conductor who'd been helping me. He knew about the fraud, had agreed to testify if needed." Jacob and Doc exchanged looks. This was no coincidence. Blackwood was eliminating anyone who might corroborate Catherine's accusations. After Cooper left, Catherine paced the small clinic like a caged animal. Tom Hart had a logbook. He kept meticulous records of every shipment, every passenger, every transaction involving the railway through this territory. He told me it documented every fraudulent sale Blackwood made, every forged contract. "Where would he keep such a logbook?" Doc asked. "He lived at the boarding house when he wasn't on his route, Mrs. Patterson's place." Catherine stopped pacing, her mind working. "If we could find that logbook, we'd have the proof we need." "My word, backed up by documented evidence from an independent source." Jacob shook his head. "That boarding house is right in the center of town. Blackwood's men probably searched Hart's room as soon as they killed him." "Maybe. But Tom was smart. If he knew he was in danger, he would have hidden the logbook somewhere they wouldn't think to look. Somewhere obvious but overlooked." Catherine's expression turned determined. "We have to search his room." "That's suicide," Doc said flatly. "The moment you step into that boarding house, someone will recognize you. They'll tell Blackwood, and he'll have you killed before you make it back to the street. Then I'll disguise myself. Dress like a local. Keep my head down." Jacob considered the idea, measuring it against the risks. "Even if you could pass for local, how do we get past Mrs. Patterson? She knows everyone in this town. She'll ask questions. Not if we have a good reason for being there." Catherine was thinking out loud now. "What if I'm Sarah Chen's cousin, visiting from Helena? Sarah could vouch for me. We could say I'm looking for work, asking about a room." Doc rubbed his tired eyes. "It's risky. One wrong word, one person who looks too close. Everything we've done has been risky. But we can't just sit here waiting for Boston to respond. We need evidence now, something concrete we can use if Blackwood moves against us." Jacob found himself nodding despite his reservations. Catherine was right. They'd been playing defense since the moment he'd pulled her from that street. It was time to take initiative, to strike back in a way Blackwood wouldn't expect. "I'll go with you," he said. "Not into the boarding house, but close enough to provide backup if something goes wrong." They brought Sarah Chen into the plan that evening. She arrived after dark, moving through the alleys with practiced caution. When Catherine explained what they needed, Sarah's eyes went wide with fear, but then something shifted in her expression. Something hard and resolved. "Tom Hart was kind to me after my husband died," Sarah said quietly. "He let me ride the train for free when I needed to go to Helena for supplies. Said his company could afford the loss better than I could. If Mayor kill him, then yes, I help you find evidence." They spent the next day preparing. Sarah brought clothes from her laundry, simple work dresses that would help Catherine blend in. Doc coached her on how to speak and move like someone who'd lived a hard frontier life rather than in Boston luxury. Jacob scouted the boarding house, noting the patterns of when Mrs. Patterson was occupied with cooking or when other residents were most likely to be in their rooms. The plan came together piece by piece. Catherine would approach the boarding house late afternoon when Mrs. Patterson would be busy preparing supper. Sarah would accompany her as a reference, explaining that her cousin was looking for work in town. While they spoke with Mrs. Patterson, Catherine would ask to see the room Tom Hart had occupied, claiming she wanted to know if it had good light for sewing work. It was thin, but it might work. The day they chose for the attempt dawned grey and threatening, the kind of weather that kept people indoors. Jacob positioned himself in the alley behind the boarding house, where he had a view of the back entrance and could respond quickly if trouble emerged. His hand rested on the revolver Ernest Miller had given them, and he prayed he wouldn't need to use it. Catherine and Sarah approached the boarding house at 4 o'clock, just as the smell of cooking meat began drifting from the kitchen. Jacob watched them knock, saw Mrs. Patterson answer, her round face skeptical but not hostile. The women disappeared inside. 5 minutes passed. 10. Jacob's nerves stretched taut. Every footstep in the street behind him made him tense. Every face that passed the alley mouth might be one of Blackwood's men. 15 minutes. 20. Something had to be wrong. They should have been in and out by now. Then he heard it. A shout from inside the boarding house. A crash. The sound of running feet. The back door burst open, and Catherine emerged running, clutching something to her chest. Sarah was right behind her, looking terrified. "Go!" Sarah shouted. "They know. They saw her." Jacob stepped out to meet them, already moving. Behind Catherine, Wade Drummond appeared in the doorway, his gun drawn. Jacob didn't think, didn't plan, just acted on instinct. He stepped between Drummond and the women, his own weapon coming up. "Don't!" he said, his voice carrying all the cold certainty of his cavalry years. Drummond stopped, his gun pointed at Jacob's chest. For a terrible moment, they stood frozen. Then Drummond lowered his weapon slightly. "Run," he said quietly. "I'll give you 30 seconds. Jacob didn't question the mercy. He grabbed Catherine's arm and ran, Sarah on their other side, the three of them racing through alleys and back streets toward the clinic. Behind them, he heard Drummond shouting for help, heard other voices joining the pursuit. They burst into Doc's clinic through the back door, slamming it shut and throwing the bolt. Catherine was gasping for breath, her face flushed with exertion and fear. But she was smiling. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather journal. "I found it," she said between breaths. Tom Hart's logbook. He'd hidden it inside a hollowed-out Bible in his room. All the evidence we need. Doc took the journal, flipping through pages of careful entries. His eyes widened as he read, "My God, every transaction is here. Dates, amounts, the names of people Blackwood defrauded. This is everything." Outside, they heard shouting. Blackwood's men had followed them to the clinic. Jacob moved to the window, seeing Wade Drummond and at least 4 others gathering in the street. The enforcer looked up at the clinic, his expression unreadable. "Stone!" Drummond called out. "The mayor knows what you've taken. He wants it back. Last chance to hand it over peacefully." Jacob looked at Catherine, at Doc, at Sarah Chen, who'd risked everything to help. Looked at the logbook that proved years of corruption and theft. Looked at the choice before them. "No," he called back. "We're done running, done hiding. Tell the mayor if he wants this evidence, he'll have to come take it himself." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, and in that moment, Jacob knew they'd crossed a line from which there was no return. The standoff in the street dissolved when Drummond and his men withdrew, but everyone in the clinic knew it was temporary. Blackwood was regrouping, planning his next move. They had hours at best before the situation escalated beyond words. Doc bolted the doors and shuttered the windows, while Jacob helped Sarah Chen find a hiding place in the storage room. Catherine sat at the examination table, the conductor's logbook open before her, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the pages. "This is even more comprehensive than I'd hoped," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tom documented everything. Every forged deed, every fraudulent sale, every victim of Blackwood's schemes. There are at least 40 families he's stolen from over the years." Jacob leaned over her shoulder, reading the neat handwriting. The entries were meticulous, dated and cross-referenced. Hart had clearly understood what he was documenting and had taken pains to ensure it would hold up to scrutiny. "Look at this entry from 1882, Catherine said, pointing to a page. "Blackwood sold railway access rights to a stretch of land he claimed to own. My father paid $25,000 for those rights. But according to Tom's notes, Blackwood never held legal title to that property. He forged the deeds." Doc joined them, reading over Catherine's other shoulder. "That's just one transaction. I count dozens here. How much did he steal total?" "Millions. Most of it from my father, but others suffered too." Catherine's finger traced down the page, then stopped. "Wait. What's this?" In the margin of one entry, Hart had tucked a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Catherine carefully extracted it, unfolding what appeared to be an old photograph. The image was faded, but still clear enough to make out 2 young men, perhaps in their mid-20s, standing with their arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera. Jacob felt Catherine go, still beside him. "That's my father," she whispered, pointing to one of the men. He was younger, without the grey in his hair or the weight of years, but the resemblance was unmistakable. "And that's Edmund Blackwood," Doc said, pointing to the other man. Without the hard lines of age and bitterness, he looked almost friendly, his smile genuine. Catherine turned the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink were words that made her breath catch. "To my dearest friend Edmund, may our dreams build the West together. Your partner always, Thomas Whitmore. Helena, Montana Territory, May 1868. The silence in the clinic was profound. Jacob watched understanding and horror dawn on Catherine's face as the implications settled over her like a physical weight. "They were partners," she said, her voice barely audible. "My father and Blackwood were partners." Doc found a chair and sat down heavily. "That changes everything." Catherine continued examining the logbook with new eyes, turning back to earlier pages. There, in entries from the late 1862 and early 1870, she found references to a partnership between Thomas Whitmore and Edmund Blackwood. Land purchases made jointly, survey expeditions funded by both men, plans for a railway expansion that would make them both wealthy. And then, in 1873, the entries changed, references to disputes, to Thomas Whitmore returning east, to Blackwood, left alone with debts and unfulfilled contracts. "He was cut out," Catherine said, the pieces falling into place. "My father abandoned the partnership and left Blackwood with nothing." She stood abruptly, pacing the small room as the full picture emerged. "I need to think. I need to remember things," my father said. Her hand went to her pocket, pulling out the silver watch. She stared at it as if it might hold answers. "He gave you that watch," Jacob said. "What else did he say when he gave it to you?" "He said truth will outlast lies. And he said he'd made the worst mistake of his life, that he'd been a coward when he should have been brave." Catherine looked up, her eyes wet. "I thought he meant the business deal with Blackwood, the fraud. But that wasn't it. The mistake was earlier. The mistake was abandoning his partner." Doc pulled out more papers from the logbook, letters that had been tucked between pages. "Look at these. Correspondence between Blackwood and your father from 1872 and 1873. They read together, and a story emerged that was both tragic and terrible. Thomas Whitmore and Edmund Blackwood had indeed been partners, young men with grand dreams of building the railway west. They'd pooled their resources, staked claims, made plans. But Thomas's family in Boston had disapproved. The letters showed increasing pressure from the Whitmore patriarch, Thomas's father, demanding his son return east and abandon this frontier foolishness with a common partner. There were references to a railway company the Whitmore family wanted Thomas to join, opportunities that required him to sever ties with Blackwood. In one letter, Thomas had written to Blackwood explaining he had to return to Boston temporarily. He promised to return, promised their partnership would continue. But the promise had been empty. Thomas never came back. The final letter in the sequence was from Blackwood to Thomas, dated 1874. The pain in it was raw and undisguised. "You left me with nothing, Thomas. The debts we incurred together are now mine alone. The land we claimed together now sits worthless without the capital to develop it. But worse than the financial ruin is the betrayal. I thought we were brothers. I thought our dreams mattered more than your family's approval. I was wrong." Catherine wiped tears from her face. "My father never told me any of this. He just said he'd made mistakes in his youth, that he'd hurt people." "There's more," Doc said quietly, pointing to another document. It was a notice from a Montana Territory court, dated 1875, a foreclosure on property owned by Edmund and Sarah Blackwood, a sheriff's sale of all their possessions to satisfy debts, and a death certificate. Sarah Blackwood, deceased in childbirth along with her infant son. Cause of death listed as complications, but there was a note from the attending physician. Patient weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and exposure to cold. Cabin had insufficient heating. Family appeared impoverished. "His wife and child died because of the poverty," Catherine said, "because my father left him with debts he couldn't pay." Jacob understood now why Blackwood had become what he was. The betrayal had broken something fundamental in him. The loss of his wife and child had twisted that break into something dark and vengeful. He'd rebuilt himself into a man who controlled everything around him, who would never again be vulnerable to another's choices. And when Thomas Whitmore's daughter had appeared in Coldwater Ridge, investigating the very railway expansion that had once been their shared dream, Blackwood had seen it as fate, giving him the chance for revenge. "He didn't just want to steal from your father," Jacob said. "He wanted to destroy the Whitmore legacy completely. To make your father's name synonymous with fraud and failure, the way his own name had become synonymous with failure after the partnership ended." Catherine sat down, the watch still clutched in her hand. "What do I do with this? Yes, Blackwood has committed crimes. Yes, he's stolen money and property. But my father's betrayal created the monster he became." "Your father's betrayal doesn't excuse murder," Doc said firmly. "Doesn't excuse the decades of corruption. Blackwood made his own choices, same as everyone. But he was driven to those choices by suffering my family caused." Jacob knelt beside Catherine's chair. "Listen to me. I've spent 15 years running from guilt over things I did in the wars. I know what it's like to carry responsibility for pain you've caused. But I also know that at some point, every person has to choose what they become. Blackwood could have chosen to rebuild his life honestly. Instead, he chose to become a tyrant. That's on him, not on your father's ghost. Catherine looked at him, then at the photograph of two young men with their arms around each other, full of hope and dreams. If I expose this, I expose my father's betrayal too. The Whitmore name will be tarnished. Or, Doc suggested gently, it will be honest. Maybe that's what your father wanted when he gave you that watch. Not just to expose Blackwood's crimes, but to acknowledge his own mistakes. They sat together in the growing darkness, the weight of history pressing down on them. Outside, Coldwater Ridge waited in tense silence. Blackwood was planning his next move. The townspeople were watching to see how this would end, and in Boston, Harrison Caldwell had hopefully received the telegram and was setting wheels of justice in motion. But here, in this small clinic, with a photograph and a logbook and the truth laid bare, three people grappled with a question that had no easy answer. How do you pursue justice when justice itself is complicated by the sins of the past? Catherine finally stood, squaring her shoulders with visible effort. We tell the whole truth, my father's betrayal and Blackwood's crimes. Both of them. We let people decide what to make of it. The Whitmore name, Jacob started, deserves to be tarnished if my father's actions were dishonorable. I won't protect a lie just to preserve a legacy. She looked at the photograph one last time, then carefully returned it to the logbook. My father wrote that truth will outlast lies. Let's prove him right. Doc nodded approval. That takes courage. Or maybe just exhaustion with lies and vengeance. Catherine moved to the window, looking out at the town. When I came here, I wanted to destroy Blackwood. Now, I just want this to end. I want Coldwater Ridge to have a chance at something better than one man's revenge or another man's pride. Jacob joined her at the window. Blackwood's not going to surrender peacefully, not now that he knows we have evidence of both his crimes and his motivations. I know. He'll come for us. Probably soon. Then we'd better be ready. They spent the next hours preparing for what seemed inevitable. Doc distributed what weapons they had, the revolver from Ernest Miller, his own shotgun, and Jacob's hunting knife. Sarah Chen insisted on staying, refusing to hide while others fought. Catherine proved surprisingly capable with a rifle, a skill her father had taught her when she was young. As midnight approached, Jacob stood watch at the front window while the others tried to rest. He thought about the photograph of those two young men, partners with dreams of building the West. Thought about how betrayal could poison a soul over decades. Thought about whether any of them would survive what was coming. Behind him, Catherine couldn't sleep. She came to stand beside him, her father's watch in her hand. "Do you think people can be redeemed?" she asked quietly. "Even after decades of choosing wrong?" Jacob thought about his own years in the mountains, hiding from his past. "I think redemption is possible, but it requires the person to choose it, and that's the hardest choice of all." In the darkness outside, they heard footsteps, multiple men moving into position around the clinic. The final confrontation was beginning, and morning seemed very far away. The footsteps outside multiplied through the night hours, a slow gathering of forces that promised violence at dawn. Jacob counted at least 6 distinct positions around the clinic, men settling in with the patience of professionals who knew how to wait. Blackwood was taking no chances this time. Doc moved through the clinic in the pre-dawn darkness, checking their meager defenses. The shuttered windows would stop casual gunfire, but not a determined assault. The doors were solid oak, but could be battered down or burned. They had perhaps a dozen rounds of ammunition total, food and water, for maybe 2 days if they rationed carefully. It was the arithmetic of a siege they couldn't win. "We should have run," Doc muttered. "Checking the bolt on the back door for the 3rd time. Should have taken what we found and headed for Helena while we had the chance." "They would have hunted us down on the road," Jacob said. "At least here we can make them pay a price for taking us." Catherine sat at the examination table, the logbook open before her. She'd been copying key entries by lamplight for the past hour, creating a secondary record in case the original was destroyed. Her hand moved with steady precision, despite the fear Jacob knew she must be feeling. Sarah Chen had finally fallen asleep in the corner, exhausted by stress and the late hour. Jacob envied her that small escape. His own mind was too active, running through scenarios and possibilities, looking for some path that didn't end in bloodshed. As the first grey light began to seep through the shutters, the situation crystallized. This wasn't about evidence anymore, or justice, or even survival. This was about whether the people of Coldwater Ridge would continue to live under Blackwood's thumb, or whether they'd find the courage to stand up. And that thought gave Jacob an idea. "Doc, how many patients do you see in a typical week?" The old physician looked up from his shotgun, puzzled by the question. 20? Maybe 30? Why? How many of them have been hurt by Blackwood, directly or indirectly? Doc's expression shifted as he understood where Jacob was going. Most of them. The miners he's cheated on assay weights, the families he's overcharged for rent, the people who've lost property to his manipulations. Nearly everyone in Coldwater Ridge has a grievance, but they're afraid to act alone, afraid of being the one who stands up and gets crushed. Jacob moved away from the window, his mind working. What if they weren't alone? What if we could show them that others are willing to stand with them? Catherine looked up from her copying. You want to rally the town against Blackwood? I want to give them a choice. Right now, they think it's between Blackwood's power and certain destruction. But if we can show them there's another option, that together they outnumber his enforcers, that federal authorities are already on the way because of our telegram. Jacob trailed off, seeing the risks even as he spoke them. It could work, Doc said slowly, or it could get a lot of innocent people killed. They're already being killed, just slowly, over years, through poverty and fear and crushed hopes. Catherine stood, closing the logbook. Tom Hart died because he tried to document the truth. Ernest Miller risked everything to send our telegram. Sarah Chen has been bringing us food despite the danger. People are already choosing to resist. We just need to help them see they're not alone. Sarah stirred in her corner, waking to the conversation. Many families want to stand against Mayor, but they are afraid. If you give them reason to be brave, they will come. Jacob thought about the cavalry, about how battles were often won not through superior force, but through breaking the enemy's will to fight. Blackwood's power rested on fear and isolation. If they could shatter that, even his armed men might think twice about following orders. We need a signal, he said. Something visible. Something that says we're not backing down, and we need to send word to those families who might help. The church, Doc said suddenly. Reverend Michaels has been quiet through all this, but I know he hates what Blackwood's done to this town. If we could get him to ring the church bells, to call people together, would he do it? He might, especially if we promise to protect his congregation if things go wrong. They planned quickly, knowing dawn was approaching and with it, Blackwood's likely ultimatum. Sarah would slip out through the clinic's root cellar, which had an exit in the alley 2 buildings over. She'd make her way to the church and convince Reverend Michaels to ring the bells at exactly 8 o'clock. The bell ringing would be a call to gather, and Sarah would spread word among the families she knew were sympathetic. Meanwhile, Jacob would retrieve his father's rifle from where he'd hidden it in the mountains years ago. He'd sworn never to use it in anger again, but that oath seemed naive now. Sometimes peace required the willingness to fight for it. As Sarah prepared to leave, she clasped Catherine's hands. If I do not come back, you tell my story. You tell them Sarah Chen stood against the mayor because she had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. You'll come back, Catherine said, but they both knew it was hope rather than certainty. Sarah slipped into the darkness of the root cellar, and they heard the scrape of the hidden exit opening and closing. One less person in their small fortress, but hopefully one more chance at survival. Jacob prepared to make his own exit, The rifle was hidden in a cache 3 miles up the mountain trail, buried in a waterproof case beneath a distinctive lightning-struck pine. He could make it there and back in under 2 hours if he moved fast and avoided Blackwood's patrols. "Take this," Catherine said, pressing her father's pocket watch into his hand. "For luck, and as a promise that you'll come back." Jacob looked at the inscription one more time. "Truth will outlast lies." He hoped that was true. He hoped that what they were about to attempt wasn't just noble foolishness. Doc walked him to the back door. "You know this might not work. We might just be bringing more people into danger." "I know, but doing nothing guarantees Blackwood wins. At least this gives us a chance." They gripped hands, 2 old men who'd found their courage later in life than they'd have liked, but had found it nonetheless. Then Jacob slipped out into the grey dawn, moving with the silence his cavalry years had taught him. The mountain trail was achingly familiar. He'd walked it 1,000 times in 15 years, carrying supplies up and furs down, existing in the solitude he'd convinced himself was peace. Now that solitude felt like cowardice, a long, slow retreat from everything that mattered. He found the lightning-struck pine exactly where he remembered. The cache was undisturbed, the rifle case intact. He opened it with hands that trembled slightly, revealing the Winchester his father had carried through his own wars and passed down with the advice to use it wisely and sparingly. Jacob assembled the rifle with practiced efficiency, loading it with the ammunition he'd kept stored separately. The weight was familiar, almost comforting. This was the weapon of a different man, a soldier who'd believed in duty and honor before the wars complicated those concepts. Maybe he could be that man again, at least for one more day. The return journey was more dangerous. Full dawn had arrived, and Blackwood's men were likely alert now, searching for any weakness in their siege. Jacob took a longer route through denser forest, moving with the patience of a hunter who knew that haste meant mistakes. He was within sight of town when he heard voices ahead. 2 of Blackwood's men positioned to watch the mountain trails. Jacob froze, evaluating options. He could retreat and find another way, but that would cost precious time. Or he could confront them, but that would alert Blackwood to his absence from the clinic. The decision was made for him when one of the men turned and saw him. Recognition flashed across the man's face, followed by the reach for his pistol. Jacob was faster. The rifle came up in one smooth motion, and his voice carried absolute certainty. "Don't! I'd prefer not to shoot you, but I will if you force it." The 2 men froze, hands hovering near their weapons. Jacob recognized one of them, a young miner named Billy who'd come to town 3 months ago looking for work. The other was older, hardened, with the look of someone who'd killed before. "Stone," the older man said. "The mayor wants you alive, but dead works just as well." "Maybe. But you'll be dead first, and Billy here will have to explain to Blackwood why he let me go, assuming I don't shoot him too." Jacob kept the rifle trained between them. "Or you could walk away. Tell the mayor you never saw me. Live to draw wages another day." Billy's hand moved away from his gun. "I'm not dying for Blackwood's money." The older man spat. "Coward." "Smart," Billy corrected. He looked at Jacob. "What you're doing, standing up to the mayor. Some of us think it's about time someone did. Then stand with us when the time comes. I'm just hired help. I don't have a stake in this town. Neither did I, once. But sometimes you find your stake whether you're looking for it or not." The older man was still calculating odds, his hand still near his weapon. Jacob could see the thoughts playing across his face. The bonus Blackwood would pay for stopping Stone weighed against the likelihood of dying in the attempt. "Let him go, Frank," Billy said. "It's not worth it." Frank's hand finally dropped. "This isn't over, Stone." "I know." Jacob backed away slowly, keeping the rifle ready until he'd put sufficient distance between himself and the 2 men. Then he turned and ran, knowing they'd report his location but hoping he'd bought enough time. He reached the clinic's back entrance with minutes to spare before 8 o'clock. Doc helped him inside, bolting the door behind them. "Did you get it?" Jacob held up the rifle. "And maybe one more person on our side. Billy Fletcher, one of Blackwood's hired men, seemed like he's having second thoughts." Catherine was watching from the window. "It's almost time. If Sarah succeeded, if Reverend Michaels agreed." The church bell began to toll. It rang not for a service or a death, but for something else entirely. A call to gather, a summons to choice. The sound carried across Coldwater Ridge, clear and insistent, and Jacob watched as doors opened, as people emerged cautiously from their homes. From his position around the clinic, Wade Drummond stood and looked toward the church, confusion evident in his posture. Other enforcers emerged from cover, uncertain what the bells meant. And then Blackwood himself appeared on the street, walking with his characteristic, purposeful stride toward the church. The confrontation was about to begin, but the battlefield had shifted. It wasn't just about Doc's clinic anymore. It was about the entire town, and who would control its future. Jacob checked his father's rifle one more time, feeling the weight of history and hope pressing down on his shoulders. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "we gave them a choice. That's worth something." "Everything," Catherine corrected. "It's worth everything." They moved to join the gathering crowd, knowing that the next hours would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of everyone in Coldwater Ridge. The federal marshal was a tall man in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades enforcing law in frontier territories. His badge caught the morning light as he approached, his deputies fanning out to cover Blackwood's men. "Marshal Thomas Garrett, United States Marshal Service," he announced. "I have warrants for the arrest of Edmund Blackwood on charges of fraud, forgery, and suspicion of murder. Mr. Blackwood, remove your hand from your coat slowly and step down from those steps." Blackwood's face had gone from pale to ashen. His hand remained inside his coat, but Jacob could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing his odds, considering whether he could shoot his way out of this situation. "Edmund," Jacob said quietly, "don't make it worse. You've lost. Accept it with whatever dignity you have left." "Dignity?" Blackwood's laugh was bitter. "You stand there with Thomas Whitmore's daughter, speaking to me about dignity? Her father destroyed my life, stole my dreams, and left me to watch my family die in poverty. Where was dignity then?" Catherine stepped forward, and Jacob resisted the urge to pull her back. She walked up the church steps until she was facing Blackwood directly, within arm's reach. "My father wronged you. Terribly. And I'm sorry for that, sorrier than you'll ever know. But Edmund, look what you've become in your quest for revenge. You're not the young man in that photograph anymore, full of dreams and hope. You're a murderer and a thief. Is this what you wanted? Is this the legacy you choose?" Harrison Caldwell, the Boston attorney, moved to stand beside the marshal. He was an older gentleman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Miss Whitmore sent me copies of Conductor Hart's logbook by her last telegram. I've spent the past week reviewing the evidence with federal authorities. The charges are substantial, Mr. Blackwood. You're facing decades in prison, possibly execution for the murders. But," Catherine said, her voice gentler now, "there's another way. Confess everything, provide testimony about your crimes, make restitution to those you've stolen from. In exchange, I'll advocate for reduced charges. No execution, a prison term instead, with the possibility of eventual release." Blackwood stared at her. "Why would you offer me mercy?" "Because someone has to break the cycle of vengeance. My father wronged you. You wronged dozens of others. If I destroy you completely, what does that make me? Another Whitmore crushing another Blackwood?" Catherine's eyes were wet, but her voice remained steady. "I won't be that person. I won't let my father's mistake define both our families forever." Wade Drummond lowered his gun completely. "Boss, take the deal. These people have you dead to rights." The other enforcers followed suit, weapons dropping, hands raising in surrender. They'd been hired help, not fanatics, and they could read the situation clearly enough. Blackwood slowly removed his hand from his coat. Empty. He'd been bluffing, or perhaps he'd simply lost the will to fight. He looked around at the crowd of townspeople, seeing the faces of people he'd oppressed for years, seeing not hatred in their eyes but something more complex. Anger, yes, but also pity. They'd won, and they could afford to be generous. "My wife's name was Sarah," Blackwood said, his voice cracking. "Our son would have been named Thomas after your father. We'd planned it together, the three of us. 2 friends and one of their wives, building something good in this wilderness." He sank down onto the church steps, suddenly looking every one of his 50-plus years. "I loved him like a brother. When he left, when Sarah died because we couldn't afford a proper doctor or heating or food, something inside me died too. I told myself I'd build an empire, that I'd become so powerful no one could ever hurt me again. But you became the person who hurt others," Doc said, climbing the steps to stand with Catherine. "You became what you hated." Blackwood nodded slowly. "I did. God help me, I did." Marshal Garrett gestured to his deputies. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to stand and come with me now." "Wait," Catherine said. She reached into her coat and pulled out a document. "This is the original partnership agreement between you and my father, dated 1868. It was never legally dissolved. Under territorial law, you're still entitled to 20% of any profits from the railway expansion through this region." She held it out to him. "It's not the 3 million my father invested, but it's something, a stake in the future you and he once dreamed of building together. A chance to leave a legacy that's more than just crime and bitterness." Blackwood stared at the document as if it were a ghost. "Why?" "Because my father would have wanted me to honor the partnership he abandoned. Because every person deserves a chance at redemption. And because I believe the young man in that photograph, the one who dreamed of building the West with his friend, is still somewhere inside you." Blackwood took the document with trembling hands. Tears ran down his face unchecked. "I don't deserve this." "No," Catherine agreed. "You don't. But mercy isn't about deserving, it's about choosing to be better than our worst impulses." Marshal Garrett placed his hand on Blackwood's shoulder, not roughly but firmly. "Sir, we need to go now. You'll have time to review that document later. For now, you're under arrest." Blackwood stood, allowing himself to be led down the steps. As he passed Jacob, he stopped. "You're a better man than I am, Stone. You chose mercy when vengeance would have been easier." "No," Jacob said. "I chose what felt right. The rest is just living with the consequences." The marshal and his deputies escorted Blackwood toward a waiting wagon. The crowd parted silently, watching as the man who'd ruled their town for over a decade was taken into custody. No one cheered. No one celebrated. There was simply a collective exhale, as if Coldwater Ridge itself was releasing years of held breath. Wade Drummond approached Jacob as the wagon departed. "I'm leaving town. Heading north. Maybe try my hand at honest work for a change. That'd be a good choice. What you did, standing up for that woman, it made me think about the kind of man I've become, the kind I could still be if I tried." Drummond extended his hand. "Thank you for that." They shook, 2 men who'd been adversaries finding unexpected respect. Then Drummond gathered his horse and rode out of Coldwater Ridge, and Jacob never saw him again. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people returning to their lives with the knowledge that something fundamental had changed. The fear that had ruled them was gone, replaced by possibility and hope. It would take time to rebuild, to heal the wounds Blackwood had inflicted, but for the first time in years, healing seemed possible. Jacob stood in the emptying square with Catherine and Doc, feeling the weight of the past days settling into his bones. They'd won, But the victory felt complex, layered with sadness for what had been lost and hope for what might yet be built. "What happens now?" Doc asked. Catherine looked toward where the wagon had disappeared. "Now we build something better. Together. All of us." And in that moment, Jacob believed her. 3 months passed before the first snow fell on Coldwater Ridge. Jacob stood on the porch of his new house, watching the flakes drift down through the pine trees, and marveled at how much had changed since that day in the rain when he'd made a choice that altered everything. The house sat at the edge of town, not isolated in the high mountains, but not crowded among the central buildings either. A compromise that felt right. Close enough to be part of the community, far enough to still hear the wind in the trees. Catherine had helped him choose the location, understanding his need for space while gently insisting he needed connection too. She'd stayed in Coldwater Ridge longer than anyone expected. Her family had called her back to Boston repeatedly, but she'd delayed, then declined, finally sending word that her place was here now. The railway expansion required oversight, and she'd taken on the role her father had once envisioned for himself and Edmund Blackwood, managing the project with fairness and transparency that was rebuilding trust in the Whitmore name. Doc Harrison had been elected interim mayor by popular acclaim, though he swore he'd step down the moment proper elections could be organized. He'd thrown himself into the work of reforming Coldwater Ridge's government, establishing actual laws and systems of justice that didn't depend on one man's whims. His clinic was busier than ever, but he had help now. 2 young doctors from Helena had come to study under him, drawn by the story of an old man who'd found his courage again. The town itself was transforming. Properties stolen by Blackwood were being returned to their rightful owners or sold at fair prices to new settlers. The miners had formed their cooperative, negotiating directly with the assay office for honest weights and fair prices. Sarah Chen had expanded her laundry into a boarding house, providing clean rooms at reasonable rates, a competitor to Mrs. Patterson's establishment and a symbol of the new economy emerging. Ernest Miller still ran the telegraph office, but now he did so with his head held high, the man who'd risked everything to send word to Boston. He'd become something of a hero in town, proof that one person's courage could matter. His wife, Emma, had started a small school for the town's children, teaching reading and arithmetic in the church basement until they could afford to build a proper schoolhouse. Jacob's role in this new Coldwater Ridge was harder to define. He wasn't a merchant or a miner, a lawman or a politician. But people came to him with disputes to mediate, problems to solve, advice to seek. Somehow, the mountain hermit, who'd wanted nothing to do with civilization, had become the person folks turned to when they needed wisdom or a steady hand. He'd accepted a position with the railway expansion, using his knowledge of the land to guide survey routes and select safe passage through the mountains. It was work that felt meaningful, building something that would outlast him, connecting communities in ways that could either help or harm, depending on how it was done. He was determined it would help. Catherine appeared in the doorway behind him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cold. "The first snow always makes me think of my father. He loved winter in Montana, even though he only spent one here. The winter, he met Blackwood." "Yes." She came to stand beside him, watching the snow. "I received a letter from Edmund today, from the territorial prison." Jacob turned to look at her. "Repentant, he's teaching other prisoners to read and write, sharing what education he has. The warden says he's become something of a model prisoner." She pulled the letter from her pocket. "He thanked me again for the partnership document, said he's been working with the prison chaplain, trying to make peace with his past." "Think he means it?" "I think he's trying. That's all any of us can do." Catherine looked up at Jacob. "He asked about you. Wanted to know if the mountain man ever came down from his cabin or if he ran back to isolation." Jacob smiled. "Tell him I'm still here, still learning what it means to be part of something larger than myself." "I will." Catherine was quiet for a moment, then added, "Harrison Caldwell wrote too." The railway board wants to expand operations. They're offering me a permanent position managing all their Montana holdings. That's a significant responsibility. It is. But it also means I'd be staying here indefinitely, making Coldwater Ridge my home rather than just a temporary posting. She looked at him. I wanted you to know before I accepted. Jacob understood what she was really saying, the question beneath the words. Over the past months, something had grown between them. Not romance exactly, though perhaps it could become that. More like deep friendship forged in crisis. Mutual respect earned through shared danger, and the comfortable companionship of two people who'd chosen to stand together when standing apart would have been easier. I'd like that, he said simply. You staying, I mean. Her smile was warm. Good. Because I've grown rather fond of this town, and the people in it. They stood together watching the snow fall, and Jacob thought about the journey that had brought him here, from cavalry scout to mountain hermit to whatever he was becoming now. Each transformation had been painful, forcing him to confront pieces of himself he'd rather have left buried. But each had also been necessary, steps on a path toward becoming someone he could respect. Doc joined them on the porch, moving stiffly in the cold. Meetings starting in 20 minutes. Town councils gathering to discuss the schoolhouse funding. We're coming, Catherine assured him. As they prepared to head into town, Jacob caught sight of his reflection in the window glass. He looked older than the man who'd pulled Catherine from the mud, weathered by stress and hard choices. But he also looked more alive, more present, more connected to the world around him. His father's watch, the one Catherine had given him that day he'd retrieved his rifle, now sat on a shelf inside his house alongside her father's pocket watch, which she'd gifted him last month. 2 timepieces from 2 different fathers, both marking not just hours, but the passage from one way of being to another. The town meeting was well attended, the church packed with people eager to participate in decisions that would shape Coldwater Ridge's future. Jacob took his seat between Catherine and Doc, part of the community he'd once avoided, and listened as his neighbors debated and discussed, argued and compromised, slowly building something new from the ruins of Blackwood's corruption. Afterward, as people filed out into the snowy evening, Reverend Michaels approached Jacob. I wanted to thank you again, Mr. Stone, for everything you did, for having the courage to stand when others, myself included, remained seated. I just did what felt right. That's all courage ever is, doing what feels right, even when it costs you something. The Reverend smiled. Your father would be proud. Jacob thought about his father, about the rifle and the lessons and the life lived trying to do right by others. I hope so. As he walked home through the falling snow with Catherine beside him, Jacob realized that the peace he'd sought in isolation for 15 years had been the wrong kind of peace. Real peace wasn't absence of conflict or retreat from difficulty. Real peace was finding your place in the world and standing firm in it, even when standing was hard. He'd saved Catherine Whitmore's life in a muddy street, thinking it was a simple choice between right and wrong. But that choice had saved his own life too, pulling him back into the world and giving him a reason to be part of it again. Coldwater Ridge wasn't perfect. The scars of Blackwood's rule would take years to fully heal. But it was better now, fairer, more hopeful. And Jacob was better too, more whole than he'd been since before the cavalry wars broke something inside him. That night, as he lay in his bed listening to the wind in the pines and the quiet sounds of the town settling in for winter, Jacob Stone was at peace. Not the lonely peace of isolation, but the deeper peace of belonging, of having found his place and his purpose, of knowing that when the next storm came, whether literal or metaphorical, he wouldn't face it alone. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything you were, but it gives you everything you could become. Jacob Stone had saved a stranger's life in a muddy street and lost the man he'd been hiding as for 15 years. In return, he'd found the man he was meant to be. And in Coldwater Ridge, where corruption once ruled, a new foundation was being built, not on gold or power, but on the simple choice to show mercy when vengeance would have been easier. That was a legacy worth more than millions. That was truth that would outlast lies. That was home.